And we're live. Welcome, Dad.
Thank you.
So this is my father, Greg Orsak. He's on the other line.
So I wanted to share perspective, which is a very important thing to have when you're doing analysis and coming to conclusions and taking actions. So recently in the news, there's been a lot of articles on stagflation, oil prices, the impact of interest rates on the economy, and there's been conclusions drawn inferring actions to be taken. And there's things that people are drawing from perspective of the 70s. In the early 70s, around 73, OPEC imposed an embargo and price of oil went up dramatically. And ultimately, it caused a lot of economic impact in the U.S. because we were a net importer of a large amount of oil from the Middle East.
Which is no longer true. We're now a net importer thanks to the advent of fracking.
That is the big takeaway. So when people are looking at, so today our administration announced they're banning the import of Russian oil and natural gas.
Wow.
And the impact of that is really going to be local. The people in California are going to be hurt. The people in the Northeast are going to be hurt.
Now, do you say it's going to be local because only certain regions are using Russian oil, or certain regions are more sensitive to oil prices?
The former. So, as you stated, we produce the amount of oil and natural gas we consume.
In fact,
Maybe a little more, it may be a little less.
In fact, we produce excess natural gas, or we have more natural gas than we're able to, transfer with pipelines and utilize. So we actually have to flare it, which means you are lighting a flame in West Texas. If you look at West Texas from space, it looks like a giant candle.
Yes.
And that's because we don't have infrastructure. Politicians won't let us build pipelines, but that's a whole nother podcast.
No, because that's the point. The reason California imports oil from Russia is because there's not infrastructure to bring it from Texas or Pennsylvania. So it's actually cheaper for them to import the oil from Russia. And the oil from the Permian Basin actually gets exported. So to make things balance, California is paying for Russian oil. And in the Northeast, they actually import LNG because the infrastructure is not there. And as you mentioned earlier, as the U.S., we're a net exporter of LNG.
So you're telling me it makes more economic sense to import LNG from across the sea rather than get it from East Texas, than to ship it up there.
Correct.
And so there's no pipeline, so you can't just put it in a pipe and have it transferred. You have to put it on a truck. And with LNG, it stands for liquefied natural gas, which is essentially gas that is really, really, really cold to where it condenses into a liquid. And so you need specific insulated pipes or insulated trucks that would allow the transfer of this liquid without it heating, expanding, and causing changes in the in whatever's transporting it.
Really cold. I don't know the exact number, but it's like minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit.
I think you mean 150 Celsius. And here's a fun fact that I heard, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can throw a lit cigarette on LNG and it will not explode because it's so cold.
That is a fun fact.
Fun fact. Don't try it if you work at any LNG facilities, but something I heard. So our politicians are refusing to fund any sort of pipelines, anything midstream, because we are drawing a hard line, no fossil fuels. Yet, when we are at war and we have to take our mouth off the tit of Russian oil, it hurts us. And hopefully this pain will bring people to realize that, hey, we have everything we need domestically. Let's invest in our infrastructure and let's be energy independent, even if it isn't 100%, quote unquote renewable. We can use that money and that freedom not only for the safety, but for the investment on those projects.
Correct. And the point I really want to make on the perspective, it's an economic point. So you have these articles that are talking about stagflation, which is something that really occurred in the 70s.
And could you explain stagflation to our viewers?
Stagflation is an economy that is characterized by poor economic growth,
It's high inflation,
high inflation,
high unemployment.
and in the 70s, it was also high unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the big difference. So in the 70s, you had OPEC formed, an embargo. There's a big impact. We were net importers of oil, and the price went up. So now we're paying a lot more to heat our homes, drive our cars, produce things, and we're sending all that money abroad to people that are selling us the oil. Today's different than the 70s. For, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're a net producer of all the oil and gas that we need as a country. So, yes, we're going to pay more to heat our homes, we're going to pay more to drive our cars, but all that extra money we're paying goes back into the pockets of the oil people that are producing the oil in the U.S. And that may be your neighbor that's getting paid to do a workover in the oil industry. It may be someone that's getting paid to supply the water for the wells that are being produced. But the bottom line is we're not sending all that money out. So what you're paying in higher prices is going to someone else that's in America. And so the overall economic impact should not be great.
Mm-hmm. And that's an impact that we wanted when imposing tariffs, say on Mexico or Canada or foreign goods. Keep the jobs American, buy American goods, locally made in America. That's exactly the impact that we've strived for on various platforms. And so I do agree it's a very different impact. One question would be, being that oil and gas is, the largest proponent of our energy sources, and energy is used in production of just about everything, all life, is this price increase going to flow up or flow down, however you want to say, into the goods of everything? Is everything going to become more expensive? Is this going to become like quasi-inflation because it's an input for so many products?
Yes.
And so one can think, hey, if we have control over our own money supply because we have a central bank and we use U.S. dollars, inflation of our own currency, doesn't really impact us that much. we're paid in dollars, we buy things in dollars, we're very insulated. I mean, we do buy a lot of goods from China, but if anything, if the U.S. dollar becomes cheaper, foreign goods are more relatively expensive, so we purchase more things domestic.
Inflation is an impact. And that's a separate topic. We'll get back to it. But I wanted to follow up. So the economic impact. So you're looking at the 70s, which had stagflation, versus today. And we both have high inflation rates, no doubt. But the impact of the energy price and the export of wealth isn't occurring today like it was in the 70s. And the key difference is we're at historically low unemployment rates. In the 70s, unemployment was running high and getting higher, and it was the combination of high unemployment and high inflation rates and this oil shock where all of a sudden you're exporting a lot of wealth. As a country, we had less to spend to take care of our kids, our families, our friends.
So we're not producing as much because of the unemployment. We're less productive. And additionally, we're sending more of our value, more of our product or money elsewhere. And so
more of our wealth, more of our gold.
Yeah, gold. He did air quotes there. Species circular was no longer in effect in the 70s. But today, it's all insulated. It's just internal. You're paying your neighbor a little bit more rather than externally. Why did we have such high inflation in the 70s?
Similar reasons to today. Over a period of years, we had, because it's a reserve currency, we were able to spend more money than we were actually earning. Think of it as you're making income and you're earning a salary and you're spending more than your salary. Mm-hmm. And you continue to borrow, increase your credit card debt. And you just pay your balance, not your balance, but the minimum payment, and the balance keeps going up.
So why was unemployment so high?
So the U.S. had been doing this in the 60s because of a number of reasons. The Great Society, we were spending money on social programs in the U.S. We had a war in Vietnam. We're spending money on progressing the war in Vietnam. It was the classic, we're spending both on guns and butter. And historically, the U.S. dollar had been linked to the price of gold at $35 an ounce. And that was fixed. And what that meant was the U.S. guaranteed you brought $1 to the U.S. Treasury and they were going to give you $35, they'd give anybody an ounce of gold. That could be a U.S. citizen, that could be a foreign citizen, anybody that showed up with the U.S. dollars. And at the beginning of the 70s, we realized the dollar's really not worth that because we've been spending, and they cut that link. And it just turned out that these years of spending more money than you have essentially caught up to you. And so the price of the dollar, wasn't worth 35 for an ounce of gold. It may have took 50 or 70 or 200, and you saw that in the general inflation rate going up.
Okay. Now, how would that impact businesses that are looking to hire and produce things?
Correct.
How?
People wanted more money, needed more money. If things cost more, they need more money to work.
Oh, so what you're saying, let me try to try to explain this. You have a very rapid, almost instantaneous decline in the value of the dollar. So if you're paying someone, $50,000, they're very happy with the salary they're making. All of a sudden, that $50,000 is now worth $25,000. As a business, if you're going to pay them the same quote unquote value, you would have to double all of your costs. And that's something that you can't do overnight. Contracts with businesses are very sticky. If you're a commodities business, you may have sold your future production for a specific price. You can't just double the prices that you're selling consumers instantly. So it takes a little bit of time for things to adjust.
So it's not just wages. If you're buying minerals, you're buying copper to produce wire for the electricity grid. That instead of being able to pay, $500 for a ton of copper, it's costing you $2,000. And that just, in order to produce that wire, I got to charge 3 times as much for the wire I'm selling to the electricity grid. Otherwise, I don't produce it. If I can't sell it for 3 times what I did yesterday, I don't make it, I don't sell it, and the unemployment rate goes up.
That makes sense.
Businesses close.
Now, just roll with me for this one. What if everybody unanimously agrees that the U.S. dollar is half as valuable? If everybody agrees and they move in lockstep, could businesses double what they charge consumers, pay double for the inputs, double their debt, or, double the amount they lend? If they just doubled all the dollars instantaneously, would it be possible that you didn't have unemployment there? Is the real unemployment impact just the stickiness of those certain things, and the dance between inputs and what you're selling it for is a little bit slower? You can't move in lockstep.
And the answer is no. And the reason I said we come back to inflation doesn't occur like that from the standpoint of everything. You double the price of everything, you double the wages, everything just goes up twice as much at the same time. You find there's a lot of distortion because of inflation. An example would be, I'm retired. So my income's based on what I saved while I worked. So my wages aren't going up. That's a fixed sum I saved. So I don't have the ability to double my income like someone else may be. There's people that are renting their apartment, their home. Their rent goes up twice as much. There's people that either own their home or have a mortgage with a fixed rate. Their cost doesn't go up anything.
Right. But I understand there's stickiness to certain contracts, whether it be pensions or leasing agreements, mortgage agreements. They're sticky, and certainly inflation wouldn't change the letter of the law of the contract. But let's say we're living in a communist society, total authoritarian rule. Let's say with the flick of the wrist, they could change everything. Could they half the value of their currency and nothing changed? Just believe in fairyland for a second.
So by fiat, the government's going to double the value of my savings? Is that what you're trying to imply?
Yeah, well, the number will go up twice, but the value won't change. Yeah, I think we're getting to the same answer here, that in the real world, there's stickiness to certain contracts and psychologies. People aren't willing to pay twice as much for the same thing. And so it could almost never happen where people, see the value, the dollar half in value and nothing changed.
It's not that it's stickiness. It's that it impacts you differently than it impacts me, than it impacts our neighbor, than it impacts our friend, impacts someone across the country. There's a lot of different factors that affect how these things go.
Oh, a simple way to think about this would be if you are a net lender or a debtor. You know, do I owe people money or do people owe me money? You know, if I agree to a certain interest rate, 2%, I'll pay someone back. And then, you know, the money gets devalued, you know, at 10%. That's great for me. You know, the value that I'm giving them is much less, you know. But on the other hand, if I lent to someone at 2%, now inflation's at 10, I'm kind of underwater. So in reality, there are a lot of differences based on people's situation. That's a fair point.
And the biggest impact is if I'm in a situation that's stable, it's easy to predict what's going to happen next year. And so I can make reasonable judgments and decisions. When you get into high inflation, I'm not sure whether it's a good thing to make an investment or not. And those are the distortions that end up making the economy less than what it could have been in a stable environment.
People act with fear. And when you're under different psychological circumstances, such as fear, uncertainty, you make different decisions. And that makes sense.
Correct. So when you have inflation, and particularly high inflation, that's erratic or increasing, people make different decisions. And historically, you can look at any economy that's had high inflation and it quickly declines.
So let me ask you this. If before we went off the gold standard, the government said, hey, we're going to go off the gold standard in 10 years. And then every year they said, hey, just a reminder, we're going off the gold standard in 9 years, 8 years, 7 years. And then we go off. I believe that we would not have even close to the level of unemployment. You might still see inflation go crazy, but it's expected. People have had this priced into their models, priced into their actions. They understand this. And in that note, you know, with 2020, we knew we were pumping money into the economy. It was well known. It was said beforehand. People only freak out if something happens that's unexpected.
And I would disagree with you, because when you're in a situation where I know an ounce of gold, I can give $35, I get an ounce of gold, it's stable, I can predict that. You tell me that's no longer linked 10 years in advance, I still don't know whether it's going to take $35 in 10 years to buy an ounce of gold, or $50, or $200, or $2,000, and it could be a wheelbarrow of money, which we've seen in other societies.
That is a fair point. Going from fixed to float, there's going to be a little bit of uncertainty. But do you agree with the idea that when a plan is dictated, communicated very early on, and held out with, that the impact is a little bit less? People are less afraid or less surprised, and the markets would react in less of a erratic manner.
So tell me, how well did the 5-year and 10-year plans work in the former Soviet Union? How well did those plans work in China when they were implemented? People starved, people died.
I'm not saying that just because there's a plan, it's going to be good. And when looking at the market's reaction to certain actions, whether or not you know they're going to happen, you know, your anticipation of these events is important. That's if you believe in free cash flow model, which Greg doesn't.
and you can't predict the future. You don't know what's going to happen. So, for example, you're in 1970 and your TV is the shape of a box and something fails. You go back, you take the back of the TV off, and you have 30 glass tubes. Oh, one of them went bad. You take them out. You go to the local drugstore. You plug it in. You test it. This one works. This one doesn't. You buy a new tube. You go back. You replace the tubes, and your TV works. Today, your TV's hanging. It's half-inch thick. It's hanging on your wall. You're not repairing it by taking the back off if something goes wrong and replacing it with tubes.
Unless you live in our house.
Would I have known that in 1978? No. Could I have forecast how that impacted in 1978? No. The predictions in the 1960s were, we're running out of food. We can't produce enough food to support the population. What's the world's population done since the 1960s?
4x.
Tripled. And we're able to feed the world because of things that change, people developed. And none of those things were foreseen at that time. So the future is unknown.
The future is unknown, but that doesn't mean we won't conjecture on what may happen. So before we end the podcast, I do have to ask you, you don't think stagflation is going to happen. I agree with you. I don't think employment's going to go anywhere up or unemployment's going to go up. Do you have hope that this recent price shock in oil is going to unify the parties on the front of energy independence? And do you think we will see potentially the Keystone Pipeline finally come to fruition, being built? That way we can be energy independent and no longer have to, wait for the world despots to sell us their goods.
And the answer to both those questions is no and no. It will not unify the current political perspectives to say energy independence is our goal. And the second thing is it definitely, with the political perspectives, it won't result in the authorization of the Keystone Pipeline.
Well, I have a little bit of faith, and if it does go through, you definitely owe me a dinner and an I told you so. And with that, y'all, thank you very much for listening to L Cubed to Lifelong Learners. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you in the next one.